is Papiamento has a base in Spanish and Portuguese. Finding out which words are rooted in which language is quite tedious because of their close proximity to one another. So then how do you go about finding the words you provided in your paper, Reassessment of the Portuguese Contribution to the Papiamento Lexicon?
Yeah, good question. So the assessment I provided in that article is not exhaustive in any way. So it was just a start, basically, or a start. It was actually the result of the research I had done for my PhD thesis, in which I went in search of the origins of Papiamento, and I think the origins lie in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of the West African coast, and a Portuguese-based Creole is spoken there. And so I was looking for all sorts of correspondences between Papiamento and the Creole spoken on the Cape Verde Islands. And obviously I came across a significant amount of Portuguese derived vocabulary in Papiamento. Just wrote all those words down, and that was the start of that assessment of Portuguese derived words in Papiamento. But it was just a start. I think if somebody would carefully go through dictionaries, Papiamento dictionaries, and just scan them in search of Portuguese-based vocabulary, that could reveal, maybe at least a double amount of Portuguese lexical items. So there's some work to do there still. Yeah.
Okay.
But interesting, because Papiamento is traditionally in the literature listed as a Spanish-based Creole.
Yes, I noticed that as well when we first started doing research, but of course, then the influence of Portuguese is very interesting to see how that would change with certain words that are borrowed that aren't necessarily Spanish words.
Indeed, and the funny thing is, if you look at the distribution of Spanish versus Portuguese words in Papiamento, you see something interesting, namely that these Portuguese words tend to cluster in the grammar of Papiamento. So grammatical words such as pronouns or question words or what else? Prepositions, they tend to be Portuguese based, so they tend to be derived from Portuguese. And on the other hand, words for concrete things, for body parts, or for man and woman. So for what we call content words, so concrete things that you can actually describe, they tend to be derived from Spanish. So the question is why that particular distribution, but maybe not a question we should go into right now, but it's interesting.
In particular, are there any subtle differences in the Papiamento spoken on the different islands?
Yes, I think the word you use the word subtle in your question, and that's quite important, because there are indeed differences, and yes, they are subtle, so they are not far-reaching in any way. So that means that the dialects on each of the three islands, they're mutually intelligible, right? So someone on Bonaire can easily speak to someone on Papiamento, on Aruba, and on Curacao, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So there won't be any kind of misunderstanding if people from different islands communicate with each other. But there are some interesting differences, yes. For instance, you speak about Papiamento, and the people of Aruba, they refer to their language as Papiamento as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, the speakers, the inhabitants of Curacao and Bonaire, they refer to the language as Papiamento. So they have the U at the end, whereas on Aruba it's the Papiamento. So that's really just a subtle difference.
Okay.
Subtle difference, but if traditionally, what if you ask speakers themselves, so if you ask local persons, then what they would probably tell you. So if you ask them about differences, right, between the islands, what they probably would tell you is that the Papiamento spoken on Aruba is more influenced by Spanish, right? Stronger, Hispanicized, and also more influenced by indigenous languages, right? That were spoken there they were still spoken there in the colonial period, but not at present, of course. And then if you ask people from Curaçao, they will probably tell you that their language is a bit more influenced by Dutch as opposed to Spanish. Mm-hmm. Also by Spanish, obviously, but comparatively stronger influenced by Dutch. And that Papiamento from Curaçao and Bonaire also in general shows stronger resemblances to languages from West Africa. So has retained a stronger West African character as opposed to an indigenous Amerindian character, what the people from Aruba tend to think about their language. But that's what the speakers themselves would tell you, and what you also find in you also find that idea reflected in the literature. But if you look closer, it's not always the case. So, for instance, Eva Eckrammer, a German researcher from the Universität of Mannheim, I think, she did some research on passive constructions in Papiamento. And what she found is that the Dutch-derived auxiliary wordo, so they use this Dutch-derived auxiliary wordo for the passive, and you see that it's much more frequent on Aruba than on Curaçao and Bonaire, where they actually use a Spanish-derived auxiliary ser or queda. So in this particular instance, you see that traditional view that the Papiamento on Aruba is more Hispanicized and the Papiamento on Curaçao is more developed more towards Dutch is not doesn't always hold true, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of research there still to be done. But generally, I mean, if you look at the vocabulary, I mean, on Aruba for strawberry, they would say fresa from Spanish. Mm-hmm. And on Curaçao, they would say aardbeien from Dutch. Mm. So there's definitely, I mean, it's not just a gut feeling. It's you see it in the vocabulary that on the whole, on average, Aruban Papiamento has a bit more Spanish-derived vocabulary where I think that's true, but it needs to be researched, yeah? It needs to be more thoroughly, quantitatively researced, yeah. So I do believe Papiamento, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think it was originally a Portuguese-based Creole. I didn't mention it, but I hinted at it. I think it's derived from or it's a descendant of Cape Verdean Creole, basically. So that it was originally Portuguese-based, and the lexicon. And then when the Creole was transferred to Curaçao, it sounds a bit romantic, but I actually think this is what happened. It sounds maybe far-fetched, but then this is what I've looked at for 4 or 5 years. So I do have some arguments on the basis of which I think that was the case. So I think Papiamento emerged on the Cape Verde Islands, or precursor of Papiamento, then was brought to Curaçao, and then it was what we call re-lexified towards Spanish. That simply means that the original Portuguese vocabulary was to a large extent replaced by Spanish, right? Mm-hmm. So that happened on Curaçao, then the language was transferred to Aruba and to Bonaire in the course of the 18th century, and then they start developing differently, right? Because then we have Papiamento on Aruba, we have it on Curaçao and on Bonaire, and so from the mid-18th century onwards, basically these three dialects start developing in different ways, in different directions. Right? They had multiple centuries to develop, right? These dialects.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, we're talking about the mid-18th century, so my math is not very good, but that's 2 or 3 centuries. And that's a very short space of time. So these dialects have not really yet developed far apart from each other, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I would say overall more Spanish influence on Aruba, a bit more Dutch influence comparatively on Curaçao, but on Bonaire, and what you see on all 3 islands, is a massive, especially at present, massive influence from American English, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, yeah. So they're also still borrowing from Spanish and from Dutch, but really at present the language that I feel is making the most heavy impact on Papiamento on all 3 islands is probably American English.
Do you have any examples how the American, is it just complete borrowing of the word, or is it like in Spanish where they borrow the word but then the spelling's different and it's very...
Yeah, so I don't have a specific example at the moment, but what I noticed last time I was on Curaçao and Aruba is just that people, they code switch, right? You probably know what code switching, so just switching between 2 languages, maybe you do it yourself, and they do it a lot. So what I noticed is code switching between Papiamento and English. A lot. So people just using English expressions, mixing the Papiamento up with mixing it up with English expressions, American English expressions, and I even noticed just people of whom I was sure that they were native speakers of Papiamento, that they would just sometimes switch an entire conversation into English. That's noteworthy, and that's where borrowing starts, right? Borrowing starts with code switching, with intensive contact between languages. And at present, I think so. So if I would have to make a prediction for what is going to happen in the next couple of decades, I think, well, like any language in contact with other languages, Papiamento is just going to continue borrowing words, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you will see that the majority is going to be borrowed from English, but it will be very, very interesting to watch that from up close and to keep an eye on that.
Okay. So we'll move on to number 5. Since the discovery of the 3rd oldest text in Papiamento, what changes have you identified between the Papiamento written then and the present state of Papiamento?
Papiamento written in the 18th century?
Yes.
Come again? Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think the interesting thing to observe there, if you look at those 18th century Papiamento texts, they're just short fragments, letters and parts of letters. These letters are most of the time not even complete. But so we do have a couple of written fragments of Papiamento from the late 18th century. And that is unique, by the way, for a Creole language, to have such early written attestations. That is unique for a Creole. That there aren't many Creoles that were already written in the late 18th century. Mm-hmm. But for Papiamento, we're in the lucky situation that we do have such attestations, written attestations. And what you see is that the Papiamento from that day was already remarkably similar to the Papiamento that is spoken at present. So it was remarkably similar. Yes, there were some differences, but they were minor and they're minor and subtle. So what you would see is, you would see a more Dutch-based orthography, and you would see some weird things there, but really nothing spectacularly different. And so what it suggests. This is an important piece of information, because what it suggests is that Papiamento had been formed and shaped and had established itself and had already by that in that period, right? In that early period, Papiamento was already a full-fledged language, so to say. So all these changes that I spoke about earlier, so going from a Portuguese-based lexicon being relexified towards Spanish, this must have taken place a bit earlier, before the late 18th century. This must have taken place, maybe in the late 17th, early 18th century. And then by the late 18th century, Papiamento has settled itself, so to say. It's a full-fledged language, and after that, in the subsequent decades, yes, some minor changes are going to take place, but nothing really far-reaching. So Papiamento has stabilized by that. Stabilized, I think, is the word I was looking for. Yeah, it has stabilized by that point of time already. And stabilization of a language, it happens when it becomes the native language of a larger group of people. Right, those go hand in hand. The nativization of a Creole and its stabilization, right? That the system becomes fixed, so to say. So we know from these letters that by that time, Papiamento must already have been the native language of large parts of the ABC Island society, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'm not sure if you mentioned that in your question, but these written attestations, they are from they were written by members of the upper class, right? By Sephardic Jews, Dutch people, and the upper class on the ABC Islands was not homogeneously Dutch or anything. Far from that, it was mixed. And the two groups that made up the upper class in that period were the Dutch on the one hand and the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews were a very important minority within the upper class in that early day and age on Curaçao and also on Aruba. And so at some point it appears that both of these groups had switched to Papiamento, so or were in the process of adopting Papiamento as their in-group and also as the intergroup language, so the language within the group itself, but also the language of communication between these different groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, and it's a rather unique history.
Definitely.
Because what you see in most other colonial areas or in most other islands in the Caribbean is that the colonial language, so the language of the colonizers, manifested itself on those islands, right? We have the French Antilles, all the Creole spoken there are French based. We have the English, the West Indies. All the Creoles there in Jamaica, for instance, they are English-based. The lexicon, the vocabulary is derived from the colonial language. But Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire are exceptions because the colonial language, it was Dutch. But the Creole, the lexicon, vocabulary of Papiamento is not Dutch. Well, except for a couple of words, but they're mainly found in the periphery of the language. Really the core, the basic vocabulary, Spanish, Portuguese, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's in many aspects, Papiamento is a rather unique Creole, right? And this is an objective observation. It's not because I like Papiamento, because it's objectively different from the majority of Creoles in the world.
So then, what fuels your research on Papiamento, and what piqued your interest on the islands?
Wow. So yeah, I was studying. I think I mentioned this before. I was studying Spanish and Portuguese in Amsterdam. I was cohabitating with a speaker of Papiamento. This was in 2007 or 2008, where I was looking for a topic for my master's thesis, and it was just an obvious choice at that point to go and do something with Papiamento, because I'd been fascinated by the language, having it around me, right? Because as I said, I was sharing an apartment with the Papiamento speakers, so I was hearing it quite a bit. I was exposed to it. And I first dealt with some smaller linguistic topics related to Papiamento, and then at some point I just reading about the language, I noticed that there was a huge controversy about the origins of Papiamento. So where does these Portuguese and Spanish elements, lexical elements, where do they come from, and why do we find this particular mixture in the core vocabulary, and this distribution of Portuguese and Spanish words? And why is that, and how did that shape? How did that take shape, and etc. So that's really what piqued my interest initially, and from that point onwards, then I took Papiamento as a topic for my master's thesis, and I just from that point onwards I've traveled there a couple of times now to Curaçao and Aruba. Unfortunately, I haven't been to Bonaire yet, but I've traveled a couple of times to Curaçao and Aruba, and yeah, I just love these islands. I love the people. I love the language, but my research is objective.
Okay.
It's not about. It's about. It's mainly about the language, so linguistics, right? I'm a linguist, so yeah.
Okay. So your work identifies contributions from Portuguese, the Sephardic community, among others, to the Papiamento language. So what about the contributions from, I know you have some stuff on West African language, or indigenous language in Aruba?
So what about indigenous influences on Aruban Papiamento? Yeah, that's a good question. As I said, the traditional thought, and you will hear this from local people if you ask them, the traditional thought that we find a bit more indigenous influences on Aruba, and many place names and names for flora and fauna are indeed indigenous, so derived from indigenous languages that were spoken there back in the day. So that's mainly from the Arawak family of indigenous languages. Arawak and Kaketio, I think Kaketio is how that is pronounced. So two major families and languages of which were spoken, speakers of which were living on Aruba, a bit more on Aruba than on Curaçao. The history behind it is that when the Dutch took control of these three islands, they focused on Curaçao, and that's where they turned Curaçao into a slave trading base, right? And that initially they were less interested in Aruba and Bonaire. So on Curaçao, they started to import slaves from West Africa, and we think that most of the indigenous people were either violently or not violently chased away from the island, from Curaçao. But as I said, so the Dutch were less interested at that early point of time in Aruba and Bonaire. So there was so the indigenous people who had lived there for ages, they were able to stay on Aruba, but less so on Curaçao. So that's a historical. Well, I would say it's a fact that indigenous people, speakers of indigenous languages, stayed on Aruba for a longer period of time, so they had more chance to influence the Papiamento that was spoken there. Yeah, that's a very that's logical. It's logical, and but again, this is an area that requires future research. Somebody to really specifically deal with this and quantify this. because you do also in Curaçao and Papiamento and in Bonaire and Papiamento, you also find a lot of indigenous influences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not this is quantitatively or the indigenous influence in Aruba and Papiamento is quantitatively significantly higher than the other islands, it just needs to be researched.
Okay. Now we're going into more identity questions. So, based on your work with the language of Papiamento, does the language reflect a Caribbean identity? Is there such a thing?
Yes, there is such a thing as Caribbean identity, definitely. I would think that the identity of people on the ABC Islands is multi-layered. Literally, it's multi-layered. So they feel part of the Caribbean. They are proud to be part of the Caribbean, right? So that if you're proud of something, it's automatically part of your identity, right? So they are proud to be Caribbean. But at the same time, they are proud to speak Papiamento. So that is a sort of, which is not spoken in the wider Caribbean, but just on those three islands. So at the same time, they have this pride of speaking Papiamento, and that is shared between the three islands, right? This pride. And that is also something that really binds these three islands. So yes, they have this Caribbean identity, but they also have this ABC identity, the awareness of pertaining to the ABC Islands and of being native speakers of Papiamento is very important for them. Remarkably important, I would say. Because, Papiamento, the introduction of Papiamento into education, the use of Papiamento in politics is increasing. And people also reflect on this, right? They reflect on Papiamento, on the strength of this language, on the importance of this language. They continuously reflect on it. I would say it's maybe they're the one main identity marker for the people on the ABC Islands. Right, Papiamento, and then of course, each of the islands, the people who live there have a separate identity from one another, right? Someone on Curaçao will identify maybe a bit, will identify more with other people from Curaçao, but also a bit more with Bonaire, and Aruba has a bit of a special place within the ABC Islands in that they have. Well, historically, they have made a couple of attempts to become independent, right? From first of all from the Dutch kingdom, and so in that sense also from the other two islands, because the other two islands remained within the Dutch kingdom, but Aruba became at least politically independent, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
It's this language, Papiamento is still the binding factor between these islands. It's the one thing that, and for that sole reason, I don't think they will have these. I think these islands will continue to really feel part of one. Will continue to share parts of their identity because of the language, right?
So, do you see a generational shift in any way?
Well, not in terms of the importance of the language. I don't not at all get the sense that the importance of Papiamento is in any way diminishing from one generation to the other. Mm-hmm. Quite on the contrary, that continues to be incredibly vital, Papiamento, and. Well, what I didn't mention, by the way, is that people on Aruba, and you know this probably because you've looked into this yourself also, is that the people on Aruba, they tend to identify a little bit more with Venezuela. And this is, of course, a logical consequence of the geographic closeness between Venezuela and Aruba. Aruba lies closest to Venezuela, and there's more traffic between Venezuela and Aruba than there is between Venezuela and Curaçao and Bonaire. Mm-hmm. So logically, Aruba identifies a little bit more with Latin America, whereas maybe the Curaçao and Bonaire would maybe feel have a stronger sense of pertaining to the Caribbean, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to Latin America. Well, then again, is the Caribbean, according to many, would also be part of Latin America. So, but let's not go there.
Okay.
Yeah, but a generational shift. Wow, it's a good question. A former teacher of mine, Ellen Petra Kester, is looking into this topic. Is looking into specifically using questionnaires, looking into language and identity. Also of Papiamento speakers who emigrate to the Netherlands. She's distinguishing between Arubans and people from Curaçao and Bonaire. But a generational shift. So as I said, one of the things that is definitely changing is the importance of American English. But that's a worldwide phenomenon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Impact of Hollywood and MTV. I mean, all music coming to you in English, all movies coming to you. This is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's also very strong on the ABC Islands. So in that sense, there's possibly a generational shift in that English is becoming really important. But as in terms of what you see and what is the danger for many other Creole languages that do not enjoy such an amount of prestige, there you do see generational shifts. So that there you see that from one generation to the other, the language is becoming less important, and parents are not transmitting the Creole language to their children, but instead are choosing economically more prestigious languages. So you do see in many cases Creole languages are endangered because of such generational shifts.
Right.
But not in the case of Papiamento. I mean, it's such a vital language. It's incredible. It's remarkable. Well, incredible, yeah. It's remarkable. No danger whatsoever for Papiamento to become extinct or anything, or to become less vital. Not at present. Yes, sorry.
Oh, that's very good. So then how does national identity and language relate to each other in Aruba?
So apart from being speakers of Papiamento, which is a major part of their identity, another important part of their identity is being multilingual, right? Mm-hmm. The awareness of being multilingual, and that people are aware there and they're proud of this. That they speak generally, and on average, they speak 4 languages. So that would be Papiamento, Spanish, English, and Dutch.
How deep is the remaining Dutch influence in national identity? And is there a sense of belonging to the Kingdom of the Netherlands?
Yeah, this is a very, very, very sensitive topic, mm-hmm. Also locally. So not for me personally, but the Dutch influence. I mean, it's still huge, and there's still so many connections between the Netherlands and Curaçao and Aruba and Bonaire. But there have traditionally been there have been strong calls among the people to emancipate themselves from the Netherlands, right? Because there's, on the one hand, there's the awareness that the Dutch were historically seen the colonial oppressors, right? Mm-hmm. And that's true. They are the ones who organized the slave trade. And those are dark pages in the history, not just of the Netherlands, but also of the ABC Islands. So there's this awareness on the one hand, and this sense of trying to emancipate themselves from the Netherlands. But at the same time, there's obviously the economic dependence still on the Netherlands, and the awareness that if you want to give your children a proper future job opportunities, you want your children to learn Dutch at the same time as right. So this is a bit of a dilemma, actually, that is very present on all three islands. You feel that there's reflection on that, a constant reflection also among the people. And you could say very simplified. You could say that there are two groups or two perspectives. So on the one hand, people who tend towards towards emancipating themselves away from the Netherlands, right? And those would also be the people who would like to see Papiamento introduced on primary schools as a primary teaching language, which it is not yet. Huh? It's still Dutch on most primary schools. Dutch is the primary teaching language, even though most of the children, almost all children who go to primary school will have Papiamento as their native tongue. It's what they speak at home. And then suddenly they go to school and they're immersed in Dutch, right? And they have to learn difficult topics such as mathematics in a different language, which is not their own. Right. So there are some huge issues there, the dilemmas, and this is an ongoing discussion. It's a discussion that started decades ago. Right. So at the same time, and that would be the second group. There's this awareness that you cannot just throw Dutch out of the window, right? And you cannot just from one day to the other just cut all connections with the Netherlands. It's just impossible. It would be an economic catastrophe, presumably, and yeah, there's such a huge interchange between the ABC Islands and the Netherlands, and migration back and forth, and people from the ABC Islands finding job opportunities in the Netherlands. Yeah, for many parents, it's just still very important that their children learn Dutch. And so, yeah, there's this issue. I think you were going to get to that in one of your next questions about the introduction of Papiamento in primary school. Yeah, it's such a complicated situation. It depends from one school. It differs, from one school to the other. It differs from one area to the other. Definitely differs from one island to the other. As far as I'm aware, attempts to introduce Papiamento as the primary language of education in primary schools. That goes back to the 80s, to the 1980s. But those attempts were not necessarily very successful, as far as I've understood, for those reasons I just mentioned, right? That many parents still want their children to learn Dutch, so they will still send their children to Dutch schools, because they're scared just of throwing Dutch overboard. Right. Scared that it negatively impacts the future job opportunities of their children, and that's one issue. And then, but it's to be honest. But those attempts are ongoing, and there are more schools emerging where Papiamento is the language of instruction. But this situation is I must admit I don't have a proper overview of how this is going and in which levels they start introducing Papiamento as the language of instruction, and this is as far as I'm aware, you can choose now. I mean, if you are a parent on the ABC Islands, you can choose. You can say, I want my kid to go to a Papiamento language school where Papiamento is being spoken, and you would have some good arguments for that, because I mean, researchers, linguists, they've looked into that, and it can be. I mean, it's most of the time just beneficial for the student to be taught in your native language, right? Especially for young kids, it's very beneficial, and it can be very detrimental to the development of young children if they are taught some difficult subjects such as mathematics. If they're taught mathematics in Dutch, in a language which is not their own. they're less likely to develop a high level in mathematics, on average, right? We're speaking on average here, so that could be detrimental for the scholarly development of children. But yeah, so that's a huge dilemma. I'm not going to pretend to have any answers there to what is. But as I said, at the moment, I think parents can choose. I think that's a good thing. They can say, I want my kid to go to a Papiamento school or to a Dutch school, where Dutch is the primary language of instruction.
Okay.
So to have that choice is one thing, but it does create kind of a shift, right, in the society. It has the potential of creating drifting people apart, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's problematic. Yeah.
You started doing research on Papiamento, but then how was your process of learning it, essentially?
As a Dutch person, it's terribly difficult to learn Papiamento, to learn to speak it fluently. I mean, so reading and understanding the language was quite, well, it was just, for me, it was just perfect because I was studying Spanish and Portuguese. I'm from the Netherlands, so I speak Dutch. And Papiamento combines these three languages, right? The vocabulary is mainly Spanish, Portuguese, and then you also have an important part of Dutch elements, which would definitely put you off. If you don't know any Dutch, then it will definitely be difficult to understand Papiamento, because those Dutch elements would just not make any kind of sense to you.
Right.
So it's certainly so. If you speak those three languages, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch, then you are in a decent position to begin to learn the language, right? But then to become a fluent speaker is just it's very, very difficult. So I went there a couple of times, as I said, and then tried to speak Papiamento. But once they hear you're not fluent yet, they will. That's a result of their multilingualism. Something they're also proud of, the fact that they speak multiple languages. So out of courtesy, they will switch to the language that they think is your native language. So in my case, I'm also not the smallest, so I'm tall, so they will immediately see that I'm from the Netherlands, right?
Okay.
They will see that I'm from the Netherlands, and they will hear it, so they will switch to Dutch just immediately, and that was very difficult in the beginning. And then the second time I went there, I had a plan. I said I'm going to pretend to be German, right, so that they don't speak Dutch. And so that's what I did. So I spoke Papiamento, and once they would switch to Dutch, I would say, I don't understand Dutch. Ich komme aus Deutschland, würde ich dann sagen. And this helped a little bit, but it was more funny than anything else. And in the end, it was still. They would also switch to English, but right? They would appreciate it. Yeah, they do appreciate it if you try. But then again, as I said, that they will be inclined to switch quickly. But my relationship with the community, I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, and the interesting thing there is I've never noticed any kind of negative sentiments towards me for the fact that I'm from the Netherlands, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though there are some hard feelings towards the Netherlands for obvious historical reasons, at present being Dutch and going to the ABC Islands, there's no problem whatsoever, and people will also be happy to speak Dutch to you. So I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Papiamento, not at all. But recently, I realized that some folklore. There have been a Dutch priest has made an effort in the 50s and 60s to record just on old school tape, to record folklore. and this has just been digitalized. These folklore exams. So he made tape recordings of those of stories, right? Of story songs, etc. These have recently been digitalized and transcribed. And there's just a need for people to look at that and from a linguistic perspective, and there's so much to do still, also in terms of the identity issues and this whole dilemma that the ABC Islands are facing in terms of whether or not to introduce Papiamento in primary schools, and to what extent and in which way, because there are various ways in which you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that there's so much to do.